The United States Congress has still not approved a new assistance package for Ukraine for 2024. And that's a problem because Ukraine don't know how many weapons they will receive. And of course, the United States is one of the most important donors. And Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, has said multiple times that before he can schedule a vote on this issue, he will need to see a strategy from Ukraine and from the White House, because otherwise they don't know what they're voting on. So I think it's a good opportunity to talk about what a strategy is, because it's an issue that is often misunderstood. And to be honest, it also sounds a little bit like maybe Mike Johnson doesn't understand it either. So let's talk about it. The U.S. Congress has not approved an assistance package for Ukraine for 2024, and that means that military aid has stopped, at least for a while. It's a big deal because the United States is, of course, a big donor. But Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, has said several times that before he can schedule a vote on this issue, he will need to get a strategy from Ukraine and from the Biden administration.
For clarity, we need a clear articulation of the strategy to allow Ukraine to win. And thus far, their responses have been insufficient. They have not provided us the clarity and the detail that we have requested over and over since literally 24 hours after I was handed the gavel as Speaker of the House.
And at first, that might sound like a reasonable thing to ask for. The representatives would need to know what the strategy is before they can know if they want to invest in this strategy. So you can say that this would be a good investment strategy if you're investing your money in some financial project, for example, or you're investing in a startup business. But this is not the way the word strategy is used in a military context. In a military context, the word means something quite different and also something quite specific. And I just want to go through what a military strategy is so that we can get an idea about what it actually is that Mike Johnson is asking Ukraine to do. At a basic level, a military strategy has three elements: ends, ways, and means. And a strategy has to contain all these three things in order to be a strategy. The ends are the goals. It's what you want to achieve. So that is the end state. What will happen if we are successful? And that is, of course, important because you need to have a goal in order to know what it is you're working toward, and so that you can make a plan that can achieve that goal. The ways are the methods you want to pursue. What methods are you going to apply in order to achieve that goal? And the methods are, of course, important because they can be anything from a very aggressive way of using your forces to a more defensive posture or guerrilla warfare or passive resistance or terror bombardments of civilians. Like, there are many different methods that you can apply, and you have to make a choice. So the ways are the methods that you want to apply in order to achieve your goal. The means are the resources. What resources will you allocate to the achievement of this? And that can be military resources, but it can also be civilian resources that somehow play a role in the achievement of the strategy. So these are the three elements, and they're usually mentioned in this order: ends, ways, means. And very often, it's also assumed that there is a kind of linear flow between them. So you begin with the ends, you decide what it is you want to achieve, then you move on to the ways, and you decide what methods you want to apply, and finally, you allocate the resources that are necessary to achieve the goal with the methods that you have decided on. So if I'm being gentle here, and I assume that Mike Johnson has at least an idea about what a military strategy is, and that he has heard about ends, ways, and means, then this would be roughly the model that he has in mind: a linear kind of planning process where you begin with the ends and then you decide on the ways and you finish with the means. So he wants Ukraine and the Pentagon to provide a clear plan with the stated goals and the description of the methods and a list of the resources that are required to achieve those goals. And then he will decide on whether or not this seems like a plan that it's worth investing in. But here's the problem. It's not a linear process where you move from ends to ways to means. In reality, these things are developed simultaneously because they influence each other. So you can have the politicians saying, for example, well, here's what we want to achieve. Here's the goal. And then the military planners look at it and they come back and say, sure, we can do that, but then we will have to use these methods that have some pretty bad side effects. Do you still want us to do that, to go ahead? And then the politicians might decide that they would rather than change the goal because they're not willing to use those methods. So these things are connected. And right now, for Ukraine, the bottleneck in this whole process is the means. It's the resources. They have a pretty good idea about what the goal is, and what they have also identified some ways that this goal might be achievable. For example, that is what the chief of defense Zaluzhny was talking about in his famous interview that he gave with The Economist. I made a video about that. So the goal is the liberation of all the occupied territories. So Russia must be militarily defeated and forced to leave Ukraine. That is the defined end state for Ukraine. And the ways are things like achieving air superiority by getting the upper hand in the drone war, and winning the war of attrition by using deep strikes into the Russian hinterland and destroy the logistics, and on the front line, focusing on a defensive battle until these things start to work, but at the same time making sure that the fighting is intensive, so the Russian forces will have a high consumption of manpower and material. So these are some of the methods that Ukraine has identified as being important for the achievement of the defined goal of liberating the territories. So in the case of Ukraine, we actually have a pretty good idea about the ends and the ways that they would like to see in their strategy. The problem is the means. Ukraine doesn't know how many resources they will have because the West has been unable or unwilling to provide the weapons that they have promised. And this is where it gets problematic. That Mike Johnson is demanding a strategy from Ukraine before he can decide how many resources they can get. Because we get into a circular kind of argument where Mike Johnson requires Ukraine to deliver a strategy before he will schedule a vote on providing more weapons, but Ukraine will need to know what kinds of weapons they will have before they can make a strategy. So obviously there is a problem with Mike Johnson's argument, and the problem is that he doesn't really understand how military strategy works or how strategy is developed, because he doesn't appreciate his own role in making that strategy. A strategy is not just a document that is provided from the military planners in the Pentagon. A strategy is developed in cooperation between different actors in the political system, and these actors have different roles, and one of the roles of the US Congress is to provide the resources. So this view of strategy, where it's not this linear process from ends to ways to means, but where there is a constant back and forth interaction between these elements, of course, that also means that the process of making a strategy is not just to sit down and write these things on a piece of paper. And the strategy is definitely not the piece of paper in itself. Instead, a strategy is something that has to be revised all the time. When you get more resources, then you can change your strategy. If the enemy does something that means that your methods don't work anymore, then you have to come up with different methods. So it's this constant process, and it's a bit like that old Eisenhower quote that plans are nothing, but planning is everything. It's the same thing with strategies. Like a strategy in itself is nothing, but strategizing is everything. The idea that we constantly need to think about these things, the goals, the methods, the resources, how do these things play together? What is possible? And we need to have the necessary people in government involved in this process. And that is, of course, why it's so agonizing to hear Mike Johnson saying that he wants someone else to provide a strategy, and then he can decide whether or not he wants to fund that strategy or not, because that's just not how these things work. So Ukraine is right now caught in this limbo where there is uncertainty about the means, and therefore it's hard to make a strategy. And they're waiting for the United States to figure out whether they want to help or not. So what can they do? They can't fight without a strategy, so they have to do something. And I think strategically, what we're seeing from Ukraine right now is that they have acknowledged the need to go beyond this uncertainty, because they can't base a military strategy on a hope that resources will come eventually and that Joe Biden and Mike Johnson will figure something out. So it has become a strategic goal in itself for Ukraine to secure a reliable flow of weapons. And that is why Ukraine is putting so much effort into expanding their domestic defense industries so they won't be so dependent on the West. And that means that they will have to adjust the methods so that they will be applying over the coming years. So there may not be a big land offensive in 2024, for example, because you just can't do that if you're not confident that there will be enough weapons, both for the offensive itself, but also for the period after the offensive. So they will focus on a defensive battle and attrition of the Russian forces from defensive positions. So I think this is actually a very clear example of how these elements of strategy, the ends, the ways, and the means, how they play together, how they influence each other, and how even though Mike Johnson is saying that he's waiting for someone else to provide a strategy for him, then he's actually shaping the strategy by doing so, because that uncertainty in itself about the resources is enough to force Ukraine to adjust their strategy accordingly. Okay, I will end it here. If you found the video helpful, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel, and also click the bell icon to receive notifications when I upload new videos. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.